Beyond the struggles, a journey of love, resilience, and growth. Over the past year, my partner's OCT has been steadily worsening, and it has started to have a profound impact on both of our lives. It began subtly, with small rituals and routines that seemed manageable at first. But as time went on, the checks and repetitive behaviors became more frequent and consuming. Before we leave the house, he has a meticulous routine of physical and mental checks, each one designed to reassure him that everything is right and safe. These checks used to take a few minutes, but now they've stretched into lengthy, anxiety-ridden sessions that can last over half an hour or more. It's become such a consistent issue that we're almost always late to everything. I've tried to be understanding. OCT isn't just a quirk or a minor inconvenience, it's a deeply challenging condition that can consume a person's thoughts and actions. I've gently encouraged him to seek professional help, suggesting therapy or even just speaking with a doctor about his struggles. But he's adamant that he can manage it on his own. He says he doesn't need external help and that he'll find a way to handle it. Despite his confidence, things only seem to be getting worse. 2 weeks ago, the impact of his OCT came to a head during a critical moment in my life. I had recently been promoted at work, a milestone I'd worked tirelessly to achieve. To celebrate, my boss hosted a dinner party at a restaurant, inviting key team members and their partners. It was more than just a social gathering. It was an important opportunity to solidify relationships, demonstrate my commitment, and make a good impression. I knew how vital it was to be punctual and composed. I also knew how long it takes my partner to complete his routine, so I planned meticulously to avoid any potential issues. I asked him to start getting ready 2 hours before we needed to leave. I hoped this extra time would accommodate his routine and allow us to leave on time. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel the familiar tension building. He started his checks, locking the door, checking the stove, confirming the lights were off over and over again. Each check had to be done in a specific way and in a specific order. If I interrupted him, even unintentionally, he had to start all over. Speaking during these moments is strictly forbidden, as it disrupts his concentration and escalates his anxiety. Despite my careful planning, his checks still consumed an additional 30 minutes, putting us dangerously behind schedule. I was panicking. The dinner party wasn't just a casual event. Being late could reflect poorly on me, especially since I was still relatively new in my role. I tried to encourage him to hurry, but rushing him only made things worse. He became flustered and started his checks over again. Finally, after waiting as long as I possibly could, I told him I couldn't wait any longer. With a sinking heart, I left without him. When I arrived at the restaurant, I was 5 minutes late. Thankfully, no one seemed to notice or care. I blamed the delay on traffic, and the rest of the evening went smoothly. My boss and co-workers were warm and congratulatory, and I felt a sense of relief that I'd managed to salvage the evening. But the relief was short-lived. At home, my partner was furious. He felt abandoned and unsupported. He accused me of prioritizing my career over his mental health, saying that I should have waited for him no matter what. His words stung, and for the past 2 weeks, the tension between us has been palpable. I've tried to explain my perspective, but he remains hurt and angry. He insists that my actions were insensitive, while I feel trapped between his needs and the demands of my own life. I don't want to be unsupportive. I love him deeply and want to help him navigate his OCT, but his refusal to seek professional help has left me feeling helpless and frustrated. His condition doesn't just affect him, it affects both of us. Our lives are dictated by his routines, and the strain is becoming increasingly difficult to bear. I'm constantly torn between accommodating his needs and maintaining my own responsibilities and commitments. I've replayed that night in my mind over and over again, wondering if I made the right choice. Could I have handled the situation differently? Should I have waited, knowing the potential consequences? Or was I justified in prioritizing an event that was so significant to my career? The guilt and uncertainty weigh heavily on me. As I reflect on this experience, I've come to realize that we're at a crossroads. His OCT is not something he can simply will away. It's a complex, deeply ingrained condition that requires professional intervention. I've tried to support him as best as I can, but I'm not equipped to provide the help he truly needs. Until he's willing to seek that help, I fear this cycle will continue, and the strain on our relationship will only grow. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know that something has to change. I can't continue to shoulder this burden alone, and I can't ignore the toll it's taking on both of our lives. I hope he'll eventually see the value in seeking help, not just for his sake, but for the sake of our relationship. Until then, all I can do is try to navigate this challenging journey with as much patience and compassion as I can muster. Chapter 2. The aftermath of that night lingered in our home like a heavy, unspoken shadow. Days turned into weeks, but the tension between us didn't dissipate. Every interaction felt weighed down by resentment and frustration. Even in moments of quiet, I'd find myself stealing glances at him, hoping for a sign that he was ready to talk, or better yet, to consider seeking help. But he was distant, retreating further into his routines as though doubling down on his rituals could shield him from the pain. One evening, after another silent dinner, I decided to approach the topic again. "I think we need to talk about what happened," I said, trying to keep my tone gentle. He looked up from his plate, his jaw tightening. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied, his voice clipped. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "There is. I feel like we're drifting further apart, and I don't know how to fix it. I need us to work together on this." He set his fork down and crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "Work together? You left me that night. You knew how much I was struggling, and you still chose your job over me." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I didn't choose my job over you," I said, my voice cracking. "I chose to protect something that I've worked so hard for, something that affects both of our futures. But I can't keep pretending that your oct isn't impacting both of us. I need you to meet me halfway." His eyes softened for a moment, but then he shook his head. "You don't understand. I've been managing this my entire life. Therapy or doctors won't change anything. They'll just make me feel worse about myself. But you're not managing it," I countered, trying to keep my frustration in check. "It's managing you. It's managing us." The conversation ended with him storming out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I sat in the silence, the weight of our unresolved issues pressing down on me. I didn't know what else to do. A few days later, I reached out to a close friend who had experience with mental health challenges. I needed advice, someone to help me make sense of the situation. We met for coffee, and I poured my heart out, recounting everything from his worsening routines to the night of the dinner party. "You're in a tough spot," my friend said, after listening intently. "But you're not responsible for fixing him. You can't make him seek help if he's not ready. All you can do is set boundaries for yourself and make it clear how his behavior is affecting you." The idea of setting boundaries terrified me. It felt like giving up on him, like abandoning him when he needed me most. But as my friend spoke, I realized that boundaries weren't about abandoning him. They were about protecting myself and our relationship from further harm. That night, I sat down and wrote him a letter. Writing felt safer than talking, allowing me to express myself without fear of interruption or escalating the tension. In the letter, I explained how much I loved him and how deeply I wanted to support him. But I also laid out how his oct was affecting me's stress, the constant lateness, the feeling of walking on eggshells. I ended by asking him to consider therapy, not as a failure but as a step toward reclaiming control over his life. When I gave him the letter, he didn't say anything. He just took it and walked away. The hours that followed were agonizing, filled with doubt and fear. Had I pushed him too far? Would this be the final straw? The next morning, he came to me with the letter in hand. His eyes were red, as if he'd been crying. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. It wasn't the commitment I'd hoped for, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed were tentative. He didn't bring up the letter again, but I noticed small changes. He started researching therapists online. Though he didn't mention it to me, H still fall into his routines. But there were moments when H catch himself and try to break free. Even if only briefly, each small step felt monumental, like watching someone climb out of a deep well 1 inch at a time. I know this journey will be long and fraught with setbacks. There are no quick fixes for something as deeply ingrained as oct. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're moving forward together. And that, for now, is enough. Chapter 3. The tentative progress my partner had made felt fragile, like a delicate structure built on uncertain ground. While I wanted to believe that we were turning a corner, reality soon reminded me how deeply rooted his oct was. The morning routinely locking and unlocking, the obsessive checking, the cestile loomed over our daily lives. But now, there was a subtle difference. Every now and then, I'd catch him pausing mid-ritual, his hand hovering over the light switch as though he were trying to resist the urge to flip it one more time. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched him move through his usual checks, I decided to take a risk. "I'm proud of you," I said softly. He froze, his fingers still gripping the doorknob. For a moment, I thought it disrupted him, that each start over from the beginning. But instead, he turned to me, his expression a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Why?" he asked. "Because I see you trying," I replied. "Even if it's hard, even if it's just for a second, you're fighting it. That means something." His eyes softened, and he gave me a small nod before returning to his routine. It wasn't much, but it was a moment of connection that we hadn't shared in a long time. That evening, we sat together on the couch, something we hadn't done in weeks. I hesitated before bringing up the topic that had dominated my thoughts. "Have you thought more about therapy?" I asked cautiously. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I have," he admitted, "but I'm scared. What if it doesn't help? What if it makes everything worse?" I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. "I can't promise it will fix everything," I said, "but I know that trying is better than staying stuck. You don't have to do this alone. I'll be there with you, every step of the way." His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll try." Relief washed over me, but I knew this was only the beginning of a long journey. The following week, we scheduled his first appointment with a therapist who specialized in OCT. The days leading up to the session were tense. He oscillated between determination and doubt, questioning whether he was making the right decision. I tried to support him without pushing too hard, giving him the space to process his fears. The day of the appointment, he was visibly anxious. His routines were longer and more intense than usual, as though his mind was clinging to the familiar in anticipation of the unknown. I offered to drive him to the therapist's office, and he reluctantly agreed. The ride was silent, the tension in the car palpable. When we arrived, he hesitated before stepping out of the car. "What if they don't understand me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're trained to understand," I reassured him. "And if the first session doesn't feel right, we can try someone else. The important thing is that you're taking this step." He took a deep breath and nodded, opening the door and walking into the building. I waited in the car, my heart pounding. The hour felt like an eternity. When he finally emerged, his expression was unreadable. "How was it?" I asked tentatively as he got back in the car. "It was hard," he admitted, "but they seemed to get it. They talked about exposure therapy and some techniques I could try. It's overwhelming, but it's something." "I'm proud of you," I said again. And this time, he smiled faintly. In the weeks that followed, the therapy sessions became a regular part of his routine. They weren't easy. Some days, he came home frustrated, feeling like he was failing. Other days, each shared small victory as meaning to leave the house without double-checking the stove, resisting the urge to redo a task. Each step forward felt monumental, even if it was accompanied by the steps back. Our relationship began to shift as well. The tension that had once dominated our interactions started to ease. We found ourselves laughing again, sharing quiet moments that felt lighter and less burdened. I learned to be patient, to celebrate his progress without expecting perfection. One evening, as we sat together watching a movie, he turned to me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Tears welled in my eyes. "Thank you for trying," I replied. We both knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, it felt like we were walking it together, hand in hand. Chapter 4. Months passed, and the rhythm of our lives began to shift. Therapy became a cornerstone of his routine, a standing appointment that he approached with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Each session peeled back another layer of his struggles, revealing not just the mechanics of his OCT, but the deep fears and insecurities that fueled it. It was exhausting work, both for him and for us as a couple. But it felt purposeful in a way that was new and hopeful. One of the biggest breakthroughs came on an unremarkable Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and scrolling through emails, when he appeared in the doorway. There was a nervous energy about him, but his eyes were steady. "I think I'm ready to try something," he said. "What is it?" I asked, setting down my mug. "I want to leave the house without doing the last check," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Just once, to see if I can handle it." My heart swelled with pride, though I kept my reaction measured. "Okay," I said. "What do you need from me?" He thought for a moment. "Just patience, and maybe some reassurance if I start to panic." "You've got it," I said. As we prepared to leave, I watched him carefully. He went through his routine as usual, but when he reached the final check, the one where he typically paused, retraced his steps, and circled back, hesitated. I could see the internal battle playing out in his mind, the urge to give in clashing with the desire to move forward. After a few agonizing seconds, he took a deep breath and turned to me. "Let's go," he said. We walked out the door, and though I could sense his unease, he kept moving. The car ride was quiet, but not tense. When we arrived at our destination, he exhaled deeply and gave me a small, tentative smile. "That was harder than I thought," he admitted. "But I did it." "You did," I said, beaming at him. Moments like these became milestones in his journey. Some days were triumphant, while others were riddled with setbacks and self-doubt. There were times when he regressed, falling back into old patterns, and questioning whether he was capable of change. But each step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory worth celebrating. As his progress continued, our relationship began to heal in ways I hadn't anticipated. The tension that had once defined our days gave way to a newfound sense of partnership. We started talking more openly, not just about his OCT, but about everything: our fears, our dreams, our plans for the future. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly a team. One evening, as we sat on the couch, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What is it?" I asked, curious. "I want to use what I've learned to help others," he said. "Maybe join a support group or share my story somehow. If I can get through this, maybe I can help someone else feel less alone." Tears filled my eyes as I took his hand. "That's an incredible idea," I said. "I think you'd be amazing at it." His journey wasn't over, and it likely never would be. OCT wasn't something that could be cured overnight or completely erased, but it was something he could learn to live with, to manage in a way that allowed him to reclaim his life. And in doing so, he was discovering a strength and resilience he hadn't known he possessed. For me, the experience had been transformative as well. It learned the importance of patience, of setting boundaries, and of finding balance between supporting someone else and caring for myself. Our relationship had been tested in ways I never could have imagined, but it had also grown stronger and more profound because of it. As we sat together that night, his head resting on my shoulder, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for his courage, for the progress we'd made, and for the hope that now felt like a permanent part of our lives. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel quite so daunting. We had each other, and that was enough. Chapter 5. As the weeks turned into months, my partner's progress continued at a slow but steady pace. Therapy remained a cornerstone of his routine, but what truly began to shift was his attitude. The initial resistance and fear that had held him back gave way to a cautious curiosity. He started engaging more actively in his sessions, asking questions, and even attempting exposure exercises on his own. For the first time, he began to talk about his OCT in a way that felt less like a confession and more like a discovery. One weekend, he proposed an idea that startled me in its boldness. "I want to go on a weekend trip," he said, his voice steady but nervous. "Somewhere close, just us. I think it'll help me practice being outside my comfort zone." My heart leaped at the suggestion. A trip together, something so ordinary, yet monumental for us. "I think that's a great idea," I said, trying to keep my excitement measured. "Where were you thinking?" After some discussion, we decided on a cabin near the lake, just a 2-hour drive from home. It was a quiet place, far from the chaos of the city, but close enough to retreat if the experience became overwhelming. Planning the trip felt like stepping into uncharted territory, a mix of excitement and anxiety. The morning of our departure, his old habits crept back. He double-checked the stove, The lights, the locks. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of his internal battle. But this time, he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry. I know this is taking longer than it should." I placed a hand on his arm. "It's okay. Take the time you need. But remember, this trip is for us. It doesn't have to be perfect." Eventually, we were on the road, and as the city faded into rolling hills and open skies, I saw him visibly relax. The cabin was modest but cozy, with a small fireplace and a view of the lake. As we unpacked, he seemed lighter, more present. That evening, we sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in what felt like forever, we weren't weighed down by the routines or the tension of unspoken words. It was just us. The next day, we decided to hike a nearby trail. It was a mild trek, nothing too strenuous, but it challenged him in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Each step away from the cabin was a step away from his usual safety nets. At one point, he hesitated, looking back toward the path we'd already walked. "We can turn around if you need to," I said gently. He shook his head. "No, I want to keep going." And he did. By the time we reached the trail's end, overlooking the sparkling lake below, his face was a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "I didn't think I could do this," he admitted, his voice filled with awe. "But you did," I said, beaming at him. "You're stronger than you think." That evening, as we sat under the stars, he opened up in a way I hadn't expected. "Sometimes, I wonder who it'd be without this," he said. "Without the rituals, the anxiety. It's like they've been a part of me for so long. I don't know what's left when they're gone." "You're still you," I said. "All the parts of you that matter, your kindness, your strength, your humor, they're not tied to the oct. They're who you are." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I'm starting to see that. It's just hard to let go." "You don't have to let go all at once," I said. "It's okay to take it one step at a time." By the time we returned home, something had shifted. The trip hadn't erased his struggles, they were still there, waiting for him. But it had shown him that life could exist beyond them. It had given him a glimpse of what was possible. In the weeks that followed, he took more risks, small but meaningful ones. He started leaving the house without completing every check. He joined an online support group and began sharing his experiences. And slowly, he began to reclaim parts of his life that Oct had taken from him. For me, the trip was a reminder of why I'd stayed through the hard times. It wasn't just love, it was the belief that he was capable of more, that we were capable of more. Watching him grow, seeing the courage it took for him to face his fears, was one of the most inspiring things I'd ever witnessed. Our journey was far from over, but it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. Together, we were learning that progress wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about finding joy in the small victories, and hope in the possibility of more to come. Chapter 6. In the months following our trip to the cabin, life began to feel different in a way I couldn't have anticipated. There was a new rhythm to our days, one marked not by the rigid patterns of Oct, but by an openness to change. Each morning, my partner approached his routines with a mindful determination, a willingness to let go of what didn't serve him. Even if it meant stepping into discomfort, his progress wasn't linear, and setbacks still happened, but they no longer defined him. One pivotal moment came during a visit to his therapist. After months of working through exposure exercises, he had begun tackling some of the more deeply ingrained fears that fueled his rituals. That day, his therapist asked him to reflect on the person he was before Oct dominated his life. "I don't even know who that person is anymore," he admitted. "It feels like I've been this way forever, but you're still here." The therapist replied, "The core of who you are hasn't disappeared. It's been overshadowed, sure, but it's not gone. Recovery isn't about becoming someone new. It's about rediscovering the person you've always been." That conversation stayed with him, and over the following weeks, I noticed small shifts. He began engaging in hobbies H once loved but had abandoned because they didn't fit within the confines of his rituals. He picked up his sketch pad, drawing scenes from our cabin trip and capturing the serenity H felt there. He even started cooking again, experimenting with recipes that filled our home with the comforting aroma of spices and herbs. One evening, as we sat down to a meal H prepared, he looked at me with a quiet intensity. "Thank you for believing in me," he said. "Even when I didn't believe in myself." Tears welled in my eyes. "You've done the hard work," I replied. "I've just been here to remind you how capable you are." As his confidence grew, so did his desire to connect with others. He joined a local support group for individuals living with OCT, and for the first time, he shared his story with people who truly understood. The group became a source of strength and camaraderie, a place where he could celebrate victories and navigate challenges alongside others who were on similar journeys. One day, he asked if I would join him at a group meeting. "I want you to meet the people who've helped me so much," he said. Walking into that room, I felt a mix of emotions, pride, gratitude, and a profound sense of humility as he introduced me and shared how my support had been instrumental in his progress. I was struck by the resilience of everyone there. Each person carried their own story, their own battles, yet they had found a way to come together, to lift one another up. The next major milestone came when he decided to return to work. It was a decision we had talked about extensively, and one he approached with a mix of excitement and apprehension. For years, his OCT had made holding down a job feel impossible, but now he felt ready to try again. With the guidance of his therapist, he applied for a position at a small design firm, one that valued creativity and flexibility. When he got the job, his joy was infectious. "It feels like I'm getting my life back," he said, beaming. Watching him rediscover his independence was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. He threw himself into his work with a passion I hadn't seen in years. And while there were challenges, when the pressure triggered his anxiety, he faced them with a resilience that left me in awe. Our relationship, too, had evolved. The struggles we'd faced had forged a deeper bond, one rooted in understanding and mutual respect. We'd learned to communicate more openly, to navigate disagreements with patience and empathy. There was a newfound lightness to our interactions, a sense of joy that came from knowing we'd weathered the storm together. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me and said, "I've been thinking about something." "What is it?" I asked. "I want to start a blog," he said, "to share my story, what I've learned. I think it could help others who feel like they're drowning in this." My heart swelled with pride. "I think that's an amazing idea," I said. "Your story could inspire so many people." Over the next few weeks, he poured his heart into the blog. He wrote about his journey with unflinching honesty, sharing not just the struggles, but also the triumphs, the lessons each learned along the way. The response was overwhelming. Messages began pouring in from people who saw themselves in his story, who felt less alone because of his words. As I watched him thrive, I realized how much we'd both grown. His journey had taught me the power of resilience, the importance of patience, and the transformative nature of love. Together, we had faced what once felt insurmountable, and in doing so, we'd found a strength we hadn't known we possessed. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was beautiful in its imperfection, filled with moments of connection, growth, and hope. As we looked ahead to the future, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than ever before.